The obsidian rotunda of the High Synod sat at the very apex of the galaxy's oldest artificial structure, a station so massive that its gravity well had to be dampened to prevent it from tearing the local moon apart. Inside, the air was thick, recycled through filtration systems that had been humming for 10,000 years, smelling faintly of ozone and crushed velvet. High Exarch Vor of the Krylok Dominion sat upon his raised dais, his multifaceted eyes twitching with a mixture of suppressed rage and creeping, cold dread. He looked down at the assembly, a sea of representatives from 100 client species, all of them murmuring, their voices blending into a low, anxious thrum that vibrated against the dark, metallic walls. The holographic projection in the center of the room dominated the space, casting a crimson light over the Exarch's chitinous face. It showed the eastern fringe of the civilized galaxy, a sector once teeming with trade routes and patrol fleets, now reduced to a jagged scar of static and silence. The entropic tide was coming. They were not a fleet. They were a force of nature, a biomechanical swarm that consumed matter and spat out dust, and they had just devoured the fortress world of Kexis Prime in less than a single rotation of the station. Vor adjusted his ceremonial robes, the heavy fabric feeling like a shroud. He slammed his staff against the floor, the sound ringing out like a gunshot, silencing the chamber instantly. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. It was the silence of prey realizing there is nowhere left to run. He leaned forward, his mandibles clicking softly before his voice boomed out, amplified by the acoustics of the ancient hall. He demanded order, though he knew order was a fleeting fantasy in the face of extinction. The report from the front lines was clear. The Dominion's warships, the sleekest, most advanced kinetic destroyers ever built by the hands of the Krylok, were ineffective. Their shields buckled under the tide's onslaught. Their particle lances were absorbed and redirected. The galaxy needed a savior, but the Synod had spent the last 5 centuries ensuring that no power could ever rise to challenge the Dominion. They had legislated peace through dominance, and in doing so, they had legislated their own vulnerability. And sitting there, in the shadowed alcove designated for the lesser associates, sat the representative of the Terran Union. Ambassador Alara Vance sat perfectly still. She was small compared to the hulking forms of the Krylok or the serpentine grace of the Hydari, but her presence was undeniable. She wore a simple gray tunic, unadorned by medals or sashes, a stark contrast to the peacocking finery of the Galactic Council. Her hands were folded on the table before her, her expression unreadable, her eyes fixed on the holographic map of destruction. Vor hated her calmness. He hated the Terrans for their compliance. When the Dominion had conquered the Outer Arms 500 years ago, they had imposed the Edict of Demilitarization upon humanity. The edict was absolute. Humans were forbidden from constructing warships. No kinetic batteries, no shielding arrays capable of deflecting capital-grade weaponry, no targeting computers, no combat AI. The humans had signed the treaty without protest, a fact that had always unsettled Vor's predecessors. They had turned their swords into plowshares with a speed that bordered on the unnatural, retreating into their designated sectors to build, to mine, to trade. They became the galaxy's laborers, their engineering prowess turned solely toward infrastructure. And now, as the galaxy burned, Vor looked at the human and saw only a useless relic of a pacifist ideal that was about to get them all killed. The defenses at the Hellion Gate have fallen, Subcommander Xylas of the Hydari hissed, his voice slithering from his translator collar. Xylas was coiled near the projection, his scales pale with fear. He gestured to the red stain spreading across the map. The tide ignores our hails, it ignores our threats, it simply eats. We have committed the 3rd, 4th, and 7th fleets. All are gone. The sensor buoys recorded their destruction. It was instantaneous. We need more ships. We need more fire. High Exarch, we must authorize the release of the reserve armadas. Vor scoffed, a harsh, grating sound. The reserve armadas existed only on paper. They were mothballed hulks stripped for parts decades ago to fund the construction of the Synod's pleasure palaces. There are no reserves, Xylas, Vor said, his voice dripping with venomous reality. We are the apex, we are the guardians, and we are failing. He turned his gaze slowly toward Alara Vance. And you, human. Your people sit in the safety of the core systems, protected by the very fleets you refuse to contribute to. You hold vast resources. Your industrial capacity rivals the Dominion itself, yet you offer nothing but grain and raw. Ort. Alara slowly stood up. The movement was fluid, precise, lacking the jerky nervousness of the other delegates. She placed her hands on the edge of her podium. High Exarch, she began, her voice calm, carrying a timbre of authority that seemed out of place for a member of a demilitarized species. The Terran Union has adhered strictly to the Edict of Demilitarization. We have no warships. We have no fleets designed for combat. To build them now would take years we do not have. You ensured we remained toothless so that we would never bite the hand of the Dominion. We are compliant. Her words were polite, but Vor sensed a dangerous undercurrent, a weight behind the statement that he couldn't quite parse. Compliance is of no use to the dead, Vor roared, losing his composure. The tide will reach the core in 3 cycles. If you have ships, any ships, you must send them. Convert your freighters, strap cannons to your mining barges. Do something, or we will all perish, and your precious compliance will be recorded only in the ashes of your homeworld. The chamber erupted in shouting. Delegates screamed accusations, panic overtaking protocol. The hologram flickered as fresh data poured in. The tide had bypassed the nebula and was accelerating. They weren't just mindless consumers, they were hunting. They were heading for the warplanes that led directly to the Synod station. The shouting reached a fever pitch until Alara Vance pressed a single button on her console. A sharp, high-frequency chime cut through the noise, not loud but piercing. The room fell silent again, eyes turning back to the human. She looked different now. The mask of diplomatic neutrality had slipped, revealing something cold and hard beneath, something that looked remarkably like pity. "We cannot build warships," Alara said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming a decree rather than a statement. "We were forbidden. We respected your law, but we did not stop building." You defined a warship as a vessel designed to deliver kinetic or energy payloads to an enemy target. You defined a weapon as a device meant to end life. We accepted your definitions. She tapped her console, and the holographic map changed. New lights appeared in the Terran sector, not hundreds but thousands. They were not arranged in military formations. They were scattered, massive, lumbering signal ghosts that dwarfed the Dominion's largest dreadnoughts. "We do not have destroyers, Exarch," Alara continued, her eyes locking with his. "We have Sol-class tugs, we have atmospheric processors, we have deep-crust excavation rigs, we have stellar-grade hazardous material haulers. We built what you allowed us to build. We built the tools to tame worlds." Vor stared at the display, confusion warring with desperation. "Tools? You think to fight the tide with construction equipment? This is madness. A mining laser cannot penetrate the carapace of a void eater." Alara's lips curved into the faintest ghost of a smile, a terrifying expression devoid of humor. "A mining laser is designed to strip the crust off a planet, Exarch. It is not a weapon because it does not target a ship. It targets rock. If a ship happens to occupy the coordinates of the rock, that is an industrial accident." The atmosphere in the chamber shifted from panic to a bewildered skepticism. The idea was absurd. The Dominion's military doctrine was built on precision, on shields, on maneuverability. The Terran vessels appearing on the sensors were bricks. They were ugly, utilitarian blocks of durasteel and ceramite, devoid of elegance. "The Terran Union Engineering Corps has been mobilized," Alara announced, turning to face the assembly. "We are deploying the civilian infrastructure fleet." "We are not going to war, High Exarch. We are going to work." She tapped her comms unit. "Fleet Director, you have the coordinates. Initiate heavy salvage protocols." The screen shifted to a tactical view of the Hellion Gate, where the remnants of the Hydari fleet were being dismantled by the black swarm of the tide. The enemy ships were organic, shifting, impossible geometries that defied logic. And then the humans arrived. They did not warp in with the flash and flare of military drives. They tore their way into real space with the brutal efficiency of a gravity displacement drive, a technology the Dominion had banned for being too dangerous to spacetime. The fabric of reality groaned as the Terran ships emerged. They were colossal. The flagship, if it could be called that, was a rectangular slab of metal the size of a small moon, stamped with the universal hazard stripes of heavy industry. It bore the designation UEC Atlas. It didn't have gun ports. It didn't have missile racks. It had grappling arms the size of skyscrapers and a forward deflector dish meant to push away solar flares. Vor watched, breathless, as the Atlas positioned itself between the fleeing Hydari cruisers and the advancing tide. "They have no shield." "DS," Xyla screamed. "They are naked against the void." "They don't need shields," Alara murmured, almost to herself. On the screen, the tide opened fire. Beams of antimatter and concentrated entropy slammed into the Atlas. But instead of buckling, the ship's hull glowed cherry red and held. "Ablative armor," Alara explained calmly to the stunned council. 500 meters of layered density plating meant to withstand the pressure of a gas giant's core. It is designed to be crushed, melted, and ablated. It is not elegant, but it is thick. The Atlas absorbed the volley that would have vaporized a Dominion fleet, simply shedding layers of molten slag into the void. Then it retaliated. It did not fire a cannon. Instead, a series of massive magnetic tethers shot out from its prow. These were clamps designed to latch onto rogue asteroids and haul them into stable orbits. They slammed into the lead ships of the Tide, burying deep into the biological hulls. "Tether lock confirmed," a voice crackled over the open channel, a rough, bored human voice that sounded like a foreman on a late shift. "Engaging inertial dampeners, spooling up the main drive. Let's see if these bugs can handle 50 GS of sudden acceleration." The Atlas fired its main thrusters. The massive engines, designed to move planetoids, flared with the brightness of a star. The ship didn't move forward, it spun. It leveraged its impossible mass against the anchored enemy ships. The physics were brutal and immediate. The Tide vessels, built for agility and energy absorption, were not built to be physically ripped in half by sheer torque. The Council watched in horrified silence as the lead enemy capital ships were torn asunder, their hulls shearing, spilling their dark ichor into space. It wasn't combat. It was demolition. "By the void," Vor whispered. He looked at the other human ships entering the fray. A squadron of vessels designated hazardous environment containment moved toward the swarm's flank. They projected fields of hard light, technology licensed for quarantining planetary plagues or containing antimatter spills. They didn't shoot the enemy. They boxed them in. They created cages of light around the swirling clouds of the Tide's fighters, trapping them in pockets of space. Then the ship's designated atmospheric processors moved in. These were machines built to terraform dead worlds, capable of venting superheated plasma or freezing absolute zero coolants to alter global climates. They extended nozzles into the hard light cages. "Sanitization cycle initiated," the comms voice droned. The cages were flooded with plasma hot enough to fuse silica. The Tide fighters inside didn't explode. They melted. They were sterilized. It was a massacre, but it was a massacre conducted with the pacing of a construction project. There were no daring maneuvers, no dogfights. The humans simply advanced, ignored the incoming fire that scratched their paint, and applied industrial solutions to biological problems. A ship designated as a deep-core drill rammed a Tide dreadnought. It didn't stop. Its forward auger, a spinning cone of singularity-enhanced diamond, ground through the enemy ship from bow to stern, exiting out the engines in a spray of sparks and debris. Vor felt a sickness rise in his gut. This was not war. This was something far more terrifying. This was the result of a species that had been told they couldn't fight, so they had learned to dominate the physical universe instead. The Dominion had spent centuries perfecting the art of killing. The humans had spent centuries perfecting the art of moving mountains. And a mountain, when applied to a skull, is a very effective weapon. "Stop," Vor whispered, though he didn't know who he was speaking to. They are erasing them." The battle was turning. The Tide, confused by an enemy that didn't play by the rules of warfare, faltered. Their energy weapons were useless against hulls designed to survive the crushed depth of black holes. Their jamming frequencies were ignored by human communication systems that used hard-line laser links and analog backups. The Terran fleet was a wall of iron and indifference. As the Atlas crushed another cruiser with its gravity clamps, Alara Vance spoke again. "We learned a long time ago, High Exarch, that anything is a weapon if you have enough energy behind it. You banned us from building swords, so we built hammers. And hammers are very good at solving problems that look like nails." The battle lasted 4 hours. In that time, the civilian infrastructure fleet dismantled the entropic Tide's vanguard with the methodical precision of a disassembly line. When the last enemy ship was reduced to scrap, the human ships didn't celebrate. They didn't execute victory rolls. They simply declamped, vented excess heat, and began salvage operations. "Scrap value is high on the biomechanical hulls," the human fleet director noted over the comms. "We'll haul it back to the orbital foundries. Might be able to retrofit some of the alloys for the new colony habitats." The sheer banality of the statement struck the High Council harder than any declaration of victory. The humans had looked into the face of the apocalypse and seen a resource-gathering opportunity. The silence in the obsidian rotunda was different now. It was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of a paradigm shifting, of a worldview shattering. Vor looked at Alara. He saw her not as a representative of a client state, but as a predator who had been politely hiding its teeth. "You knew," Vor said, his voice trembling. "You knew that if we were attacked, we would fail. You let us think we were the protectors." Alara shook her head slowly. "We hoped you would be. We hoped the Dominion would be the shield it promised to be. But we are realists, High Exarch. We know that in a galaxy this old and this dark, peace is an anomaly. You build walls to keep the monsters out. We built the machines to kill the monsters if they ever got in. We respected your laws, but we never neglected our survival. The political fallout was immediate but unspoken. As the footage of the battle played in loops on the screens, the representatives of the 100 client species looked at the Dominion High Exarch, and then they looked at the small human woman. The balance of power had not just shifted, it had evaporated. The Dominion's fleets were glass cannons, beautiful, expensive, and fragile. The Terran Union's fleet was a sledgehammer, ugly, cheap, and unbreakable. The realization rippled through the room. The humans could have conquered the galaxy at any point in the last 2 centuries. They simply hadn't bothered because it was more profitable to trade with it. "This is not the end," Xylas the Hydari said, his voice quiet, his eyes fixed on a new set of data scrolling across his console. He was the first to notice it, perhaps because his species was naturally paranoid. "The tide, they were not invading." The room went still. "Explain," Vor commanded, though his authority felt hollow now. Xylas gestured to the trajectory lines of the destroyed enemy fleet. "They were running. Their engines were pushed past the red line before they even engaged us. Their formation was not an attack wedge, it was a scatter pattern. They were fleeing something." Alara Vance frowned, her composure cracking for the first time. She tapped her comms. "Director, analyze the wake of the enemy fleet. Look for background radiation. Look for anything trailing them." The response from the Atlas took a long minute. When it came, the voice of the board foreman was gone, replaced by a tone of professional, icy concern. "Ambassador, we are picking up a signal. It's not local. It's coming from outside the galactic rim. It's massive. The signal strength suggests an energy source roughly the size of a Dyson structure, and it's moving." The holographic map zoomed out past the debris field of the battle, past the borders of the Dominion, into the deep, cold dark of intergalactic space. There, a shadow was moving against the stars. It wasn't a fleet. It was a single object, vast beyond comprehension, blotting out the light of distant galaxies as it passed. The entropic tide, the scourge that had terrified the Dominion, had been nothing more than rats fleeing a burning ship. The real fire was approaching. Alara looked up at the High Exarch. The animosity, the politics, the history of repression, it all seemed suddenly petty, small, and infinitely distant. The scale of the universe had just asserted itself. "Exarch," Alara said, her voice steady but grave. "It seems we have a new problem." Vor looked at the shadow on the screen, then at the human fleets holding position in the void. He realized that the definition of a warship no longer mattered. All that mattered was survival. He stood up not as a ruler, but as a frightened being looking for an ally. "Your construction ships," Vor said, struggling with the words. "Can they build bigger?" Alara looked at the data stream, at the impossible size of the approaching shadow. She thought of the shipyards in the Sol system, the ring forges around Jupiter, the antimatter siphons orbiting the sun. She thought of the blueprints the Terran engineers had drawn up in secret, theoretical designs for asteroid deflection that were essentially planetary railguns. "Exarch," she said, and for the first time a genuine smile touched her lips, not of arrogance, but of grim determination. "We are humans. We don't just build bigger, we build what is necessary. If you want us to build a wall against the dark, we will build it. But this time," she paused, looking around the silent chamber, meeting the gaze of every terrified alien diplomat, "this time we build it together. No bans, no restrictions. We share the technology, we share the burden." Vor nodded slowly. The pride of the Krylok was a casualty of the day. But the survival of the species was the prize. "Agreed," he said. "The edict is rescinded. The Dominion requests the aid of the Terran Union." The words hung in the air, a capitulation that marked the end of an era and the beginning of something new. The Atlas turned its sensors toward the deep dark. On the bridge of the massive industrial vessel, the crew looked out at the stars. They weren't soldiers. They were welders, miners, engineers, and physicists. They didn't know how to march in formation, but they knew how to weld a hull plate while taking radiation fire. They knew how to make things work when the universe wanted them to break. As the signal from the dark grew louder, a rhythmic pulsing that sounded like the heartbeat of a god, the human fleet director opened a channel to the entire council. "We see it," he said. "We're going to need more metal. We're going to need a lot more metal. And someone tell the Exarch to start evacuating the outer rim. We're going to turn those sectors into a fortress." The camera pulled back from the obsidian rotunda, passing through the hull of the station, drifting out into the void where the blocky, ugly shapes of the human ships floated amidst the wreckage of the sleek alien destroyers. They looked like jagged rocks in a stream of silver, but rocks endure. The story of the galaxy had been written by those who wielded swords, but the next chapter would be written by those who held the shields. The humans had not been allowed to build warships, so they had built the foundation of a fortress that would span the stars. And as the shadow from the void crept closer, bringing with it a silence deeper than death, the engines of the Terran fleet flared to life, not with the roar of aggression, but with the steady, rhythmic thrum of industry. The work was just beginning. In the quiet of the council chamber, Alara Vance sat back down. The trembling in her hands was slight but present. She knew what was coming. The tide had been a test, a stress fracture to see if the galaxy would break. They had held, but only just. She looked at Vor, who was now barking orders to his generals, integrating human logistical data into the Dominion command net. The barrier between ruler and worker had dissolved. Alara pulled up a file on her personal slate, a file that had been encrypted for 200 years. It was titled Project World Breaker. It was a design for a mining tool, technically. A tool designed to crack a planet's core to harvest geothermal energy. It could also, theoretically, crack a Dyson sphere. She hesitated, her finger hovering over the send command to the Dominion High Command. It was a weapon of terrible power disguised as a generator. "Ambassador," Xylas asked, noticing her hesitation, Is there something else?" Alara looked at the alien, at his fear, and at the unity that was fragilely forming in the room. "Just checking the inventory, Sub-Commander," she lied smoothly. "Just checking the inventory." She closed the file. Not yet. The galaxy wasn't ready for the world breaker, but they would be. Soon they would have to be. For now, the hammers would suffice. But in the back of her mind, she knew the truth that humanity had carried with them since they first looked up at the stars and felt the cold bite of the unknown. You don't build walls because you hate what's outside. You build walls because you love what's inside. And humanity loved this messy, broken, bureaucratic galaxy enough to turn it into an impregnable fortress. One rivet, one girder, one mining accident at a time. The shadow loomed, but the sparks of welding torches began to bloom across the system like new stars. The builders had arrived, and they would not be moved.